Good afternoon. My name is Scott Comer, and I've had the privilege of teaching many of the graduates here sitting tonight. One of the first things I tell ninth graders when they arrive at Pacifica Christian is very simple. You have 8 semesters to go before you walk across this stage. This is followed by the question, who will you become? At the beginning, 8 semesters seem impossibly far in the future. Freshmen hear it while trying to learn the campus, meet new people, and navigate the unfamiliar rhythms of high school life. Graduation exists, if at all, is mostly an abstraction somewhere far off in the distance. And then, slowly, the semesters disappear. Years of seminars, homecomings, practices, playoffs, performances, chapel services, awards nights, and senior chapels form a rhythmic routine that once seemed endless and is now rightly revealed as ephemeral and will eventually quietly recede into memory. And somewhere along the way, graduation stopped feeling theoretical. It became real. Now words that were once aspirational have taken on flesh. Class of 2026, 8 semesters have come and gone. And I'm sure that somewhere along the way, many students began to realize that those routines were doing more than filling calendar slots or passing time. They were shaping habits, affections, disciplines, and ways of seeing the world. And often, seniors, you did not fully recognize what you were receiving until you stand at a threshold like this one. Here at those threshold areas of our lives, we hear old truths with new ears. Because all of us teachers know there are moments when our students simply can't hear us. That's why teaching is, in many ways, the long and patient rehearsal of truths that may not be fully received until years later, like parenting. Why does this happen? Why don't students always understand immediately? Well, sometimes truth just arrives too soon, and the soil of students' hearts and minds has not yet been prepared. Students are distracted, anxious, exhausted, or carrying burdens that are invisible to everyone around them. And sometimes human beings naturally resist truths that make demands on us. Thomas Aquinas captured this reality when he wrote, "Whatever is received according to the mode and the degree of the receiver." Suddenly, the experience of teaching begins to make more sense. Ninth graders do not lock onto a shared truth because of a lack of intelligence or ability, but because they are wondering if their friends took their Uber Eats order from outside the table in the courtyard. What Aquinas understood was that human beings do not receive reality neutrally. We receive the world and reality through the condition of our souls, through our loves, fears, and desires. And that means one of the most important questions in human life is not merely, what do I know? It is what type of person I am becoming. Because over time, we become either more capable of receiving truth honestly, or we become more resistant to it. Centuries later, the poet William Blake expressed a remarkably similar idea in his poem, The Clod and the Pebble. 2 voices describe love in completely disparate ways because of the condition of their souls. The poem begins with a lowly clod where he says, "Love seeketh not itself to please, nor for itself hath any care, but for another gives up its ease and builds a heaven and hell's despair." But Blake gives a very different perspective to the privileged pebble. It says, "Love seeketh only self to please, to bind another to its delight, joys in another's loss of ease, and builds a hell in heaven's despite." The clod is soft, open, and self-giving. The pebble is hardened, defensive, curved inward upon itself. They inhabit the same world. They use the same word, love, and yet receive reality completely differently. And ladies and gentlemen, this is not just poetry or philosophy, it is human life. That is why education, and especially Christian education, can never be merely informational. Education in its essence is transformation. An educated person is not simply someone with more knowledge or sharper skills. Education changes the individual. In the same way, an adult is hardly a taller child or a butterfly is just a winged caterpillar, genuine education transforms the way human beings perceive, judge, love, endure, and live. Whether you realize it or not, seniors, this is what your teachers at Pacifica Christian were doing over the last 4 years, which is why they repeated so many truths to you again and again. Things like practice makes progress. Mistakes are required. Get off the road to mediocrity and write me something beautiful. Now, as freshmen, many of you encountered Odysseus, a man formed not through comfort or perfection, but through wandering, suffering, perseverance, and repeated failure. The ancient world understood something that we often forget. Wisdom is usually acquired painfully. Many of you have had a teacher tell you, practice makes progress. And alongside that, another teacher offering something maybe even stranger, mistakes are required. At times, you probably interpreted those phrases simply as educational encouragement, something teachers say to soften the disappointment after failure. But they point towards something much deeper. One of the great lies of modern life is that the only meaningful currency in school and life is perfection. Perfect grades, perfect resumes, perfect bodies, perfectly curated lives. Christianity neither confuses holiness with human flawlessness, nor wisdom with the avoidance of failure. Only God is perfect. Your value, class of 2026, does not rest in your performance or your achievement. It rests in the fact that you were made in the image of God and are dearly loved by Him. We live in a culture that increasingly treats human beings like projects to perfect rather than souls to form. And the result of this is not often maturity, but anxiety and exhaustion. To this end, you later encountered Macbeth, a man who does not lose himself all at once, but gradually, choice by choice, compromise by compromise. The road to mediocrity is rarely dramatic. Many of you have heard a teacher remind you to get off the road to mediocrity. Mediocrity should never be confused with humility. Humility is denying yourself so you can receive something greater. Mediocrity is denying something greater so that you can protect yourself. Humility does not require the abandonment of excellence. Christianity does reject perfectionism, but it also rejects the wasting of gifts from God that you are supposed to steward wisely. Do not neglect them. I agree with Tris. So many people never attempt to be excellent because they are afraid of failing. If you don't try, you cannot fail. But one of the great tragedies of life is not failing while attempting something meaningful. These failed attempts can be redeemed for your ultimate good and for God's glory. The greater tragedy is refusing to become who and what you might have been because of fear and the need for comfort. And those things becoming more important than your calling. Seniors, the purpose of education was never merely to help you succeed. It was to prepare you for a life of truth, responsibility, and vocation. Yet vocation requires more than talent, ambition, or effort. It requires the ability to see reality rightly. Class of 2026, one of your English teachers often told you before Times Writings to write her something beautiful. At first, many of you have thought this advice may have been about diction, syntax, or stronger thesis statements. But over time, I suspect many of you began realizing that your teacher was asking for something so much deeper than elegant papers. Because beautiful writing requires attentiveness, discipline, and a clarity to treat words, and for that matter, ideas, reality, and people itself as meaningful things deserving care rather than objects to be used, dismissed, or simplified. And perhaps that matters because truth and beauty were never meant to be enemies. If God is truth and the creator of the beautiful world itself, then both truth and beauty necessarily reflect his nature, which means learning to think well, speak well, create beautifully are not superficial things. They are part of learning to perceive reality rightly. And once human beings lose the ability to perceive reality truthfully, we begin to lose ourselves. As seniors, you saw this as many of you wrestled with Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, a man capable of extraordinary intelligence and reasoning, yet increasingly incapable of receiving reality truthfully because pride and ideology had distorted his vision of the world. Dostoevsky understood something deeply unsettling, that the greatest human crises are often not informational, but spiritual and moral. Human beings can become brilliant and yet profoundly lost. Addie spoke to this earlier with the phenomenon of the more clever devils. Others of you saw this in Flannery O'Connor's Misfit, From a Good Man is Hard to Find. He reaches a similarly terrifying conclusion. He's articulate, perceptive, even reflective, and yet something inside him has become deeply disordered. Because intelligence alone does not guarantee wisdom. Human beings need sharp minds, but they also need rightly ordered loves. Because intelligence alone cannot tell us whether a thing is worth loving. And that is why the most important question your teachers were ever trying to place before you was not merely what will you achieve, but who are you becoming? The world is always trying to shape our loves, fears, habits, and imagination. It will constantly attempt to tell us what matters, who should be loved, and what kind of life is worth pursuing. Much of that type of formation happens quietly through comfort, distraction, entertainment, and habit. And remember, no human being becomes something in isolation, which means adulthood requires more than intelligence. It requires intentionality. Class of 2026, over the last 4 years, your teachers have tried, imperfectly, but sincerely, to place certain truths before you again and again. That truth matters, that beauty matters, and that the soul is shaped by what it learns to love. Because no one drifts accidentally towards wisdom. And that is why Pacifica Christian's motto matters so deeply: thinking and living well. Because ultimately, Christian education was never merely about preparing you for careers or university or professional success. That's part of the program. It was about helping you become fully alive to God and all that he created you to be. The world that you are entering desperately needs intelligent people, but even more, it needs wise people. Men and women whose minds are sharp, whose loves are rightly ordered, and whose lives bear witness to truth. So wherever God leads you next, do not merely ask, what will I achieve? Ask, who am I becoming? Class of 2026, may you become people who think well, live well, love well, and walk faithfully with Christ.